Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Close of Business Tuesday. We are going offshore today, and we're super excited to have Erik Milito with us. He's the president of the National Ocean Industries Association. Before that, he was with API. He is a veteran. He is a graduate of Notre Dame and Marquette, and he is a friend of the oil and gas industry. Erik, let me just say welcome. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, we can't wait to hear what's going on in the halls of power in Washington, D.C. and everything that you have going on offshore. Before we jump in with Erik, Mike Bradley, what is on your mind? What's happening on the screen? Let's get this audience fired up.
Fired up, huh? Well, there's a little bit of green on the screen today, so that's about as good as can be said. I mean, look, energy has been sort of in a sideways pattern here for the last couple weeks, and it continues that way. And people keep asking, well, why is that? And the reason why is that there's a lot of cross currents going on right now. I think the biggest issue is concerns over demand. What's demand going to be like? Today we got the headline of the J&J vaccine being kind of pulled and re-examined, and that's just kind of resulting in people's concern for demand in Q2 and Q3. On the other hand, today we saw OPEC come out with their demand, adjustments up for the remainder of this year, and we're up to almost 99.6 million barrels, I think it was for Q4. I mean, think about that. We're almost back to 100 million in Q4. And so what the market's dealing with right now is, like I said, a lot of cross currents. Beginning in next Wednesday, you're going to have a couple of the big three oil service firms starting to present earnings. I think what you're going to hear from those guys is activity levels are okay, pricing is not there, and they're going to be basically talking about what their vendors are, the E&P companies are giving them guidance in the second half. And I think what you're going to hear is guidance is not going to be much of an activity increase. And that goes into what are the E&Ps going to be saying on Q1 earnings. A lot of these companies have already delivered some results simply because they kind of had to get out there because of the Q1 winning results, and they've already given their earnings for not their earnings, but their guide for Q1, and that's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, you had Continental today was okay, and Fang today was okay, and the market's just sitting there looking for guidance, and so we're not going to get that. So what I think the market is just sitting there going, we're just kind of in a holding pattern until we really make a directional change, either higher or lower. I think demand stats continue to say that things are going to get better in the second half. It's just really what's going to look like in the next 30, 60, 90 days. And that's what the market is having trouble with right now. So energy is just kind of going sideways. And that's not such a bad thing. We've said for a long time that energy is going to have to basically pull back, stabilize before the next move higher. We think that's in the second half of this year. The demand stats right now are getting people concerned, but supply is being held off as well. So, things look okay. I mean, that's the best that can be said right now. Things don't look fantastic. They look okay, and to me, that's okay.
Okay. There was a lot of okays in there.
Okay.
Matt Portillo, I know you were going to talk about natural gas. Will you answer one question for us, though, after you talk about natural gas? So I'm kind of giving your mind some time to think about this one. Outside of oil and gas, what do we look for these new energy companies to be talking about as we go into earnings? Like, they don't have the same type of, so just think about that. I know it's a broad menu. It's a huge portfolio of companies, but talk gas and then maybe chew on that one question if you don't mind.
Sure thing. I think Mike was kind of talking about market sentiment today, and we'd agree with that. There's not a whole lot of optimism or pessimism at the moment on the equities. It's just generally kind of in a holding pattern from a trading standpoint. We think this might be the time to start doing some work on the gas equities again. I co-cover the gas macro with Jordan McNiven, and kind of coming into the shoulder season it was time to move to the sidelines for a short period of time. Typically we get a little softness in gas. We have a lot of volatility with the winter weather. But right now, we do see actually a very strong trading setup here over the next few months on the commodity from a physical standpoint. There's a couple things that are really working in our favor. First and foremost, supply remains constrained. We're running about 91 BCF a day of natural gas supply, which is generally expecting for the full year to average. And even though you're seeing a bit of an uptick in the Haynesville rig, That's basically being offset by legacy gas basin declines. And then when you the associated market, there's just not a lot of production growth out there for 2021. So when we're out kind of the associated streams, that's a 2022 story. On top of that, the LNG market is sending shipments full all out. We're running at about 11 BCF a day. European gas storage got drawn down to exceedingly low levels from a very high starting point coming into winter. And that's very healthy for the market because that means our LNG shipments in Q2 and Q3 are going to remain bid. And we think we're going to see high utilization rates. And then finally, we're seeing some surprise in areas like Mexico, where send-outs over the last few weeks have actually surprised to the upside. We're pushing close to 7 BCF a day of gas exports to Mexico. So what does this all for the commodity? As we kind of look at the weather-adjusted undersupplied figures, we think we're running about 1 to 2 BCF a day. Weather as we hit that summer time frame and we see LNG shipments continuing to remain at high utilization rates, that's going to put us into a point where we do think by Q3 of this year, we'll be at about 3.3 TCF of gas. That's a very low level from what we've seen over the last 3 to 4 years. Typically coming into that winter period, we were pushing north of 4 and in a lot of cases 4.1 TCF, and the gas curve was always under pressure. So this year's setup is very different. And I think that's going to lead to a rise in the commodity price on both the end and the back end of the curve. So we're still gas to head towards 325 over the next few months. Kind of June, July time is where we're getting excited about the curve. And then as we head into winter, we think there'll be a bit of a winter premium bid into the market closer to 350. And with all that being said, as we look out over the next couple of years, we remain constructive on the next kind of 2 to 3 years for natural gas, which means the equities will do quite well. And we do think it's time to start doing some work again after kind of taking a pause or a breather here over the last few months, given that we came into that shoulder season.
Okay, great. And do you have, you've been doing a great job, leading our research department to look at all forms of energy, both in a macro sense and some specific stocks. But what would you say about the new energy or alternative energy world going into earnings season and what people are looking to hear, if anything?
Yeah, I think there will be 2 key topics that'll be a focus. First and foremost, we got potentially a very large infrastructure bill on which may change a lot of the tax policies in a good way, I think, for the new energy sector. And that obviously would lead to potentially kind of higher expectations for growth over the next couple of years. So I think in the power market in particular, and we kind of covered a little bit of this in the solar discussion last week, some of those tax credits are important. And then I think on the automotive side of things, too much, I think there's going to be a key focus on what the infrastructure bill might bring to EV tax credits. There's potentially a chance the cap on those tax credits that's been in place for quite some time might be lifted. There's been some discussion that the rebate might be increased. And then on the negative side, I think there's going to be some conversations, particularly in autos, around the semi shortage that's been ongoing. That's potentially impact kind of the Q1 and Q2 earnings outlook. So there's going to be some back and forth, but I think policy is probably going to be one of the key questions we're going to be hearing a lot about, because a lot going on out of Washington right now, and a lot of that is leaning towards a favorable outcome for kind of the broader green energy movement, which obviously benefits a lot of the new energy.
Yeah, so it's really interesting in the classic energy world, a lot of focus on micro, very specific things, and in this alternative energy world, a lot of focus on these big macro, type of things. Anyway, pretty interesting stuff. Craig Webster, you were going to give us a little bit of a ESG tidbit, I think, today.
Yeah, thanks, Maynard. Just a comment. There was an interesting release last week from the SEC. Something called the Division of Examinations, and they put out something called a risk alert. And a risk alert's not a regulation, it's not a rule. It's just they do these examinations on a whole host of issues, and every now and then they release something. And this one related to ESG and fund management. And what it was really looking at was whether or not the asset management world, fund managers and investment advisors are really doing what they are saying they're doing. So there's been this explosion in ESG funds and ESG investing. Of course, there is an element of this that's marketing, and the SEC is taking a closer look at it. And it's whether or not companies are actually doing what they're saying they're doing in their marketing. Are they making unsubstantiated claims around the efficacy of ESG investing? Are there processes and procedures in place for them to actually do what they're saying they're doing? And so I think it's really just part of the ongoing conversation when it comes to ESG. It's kind of part of the growing up, right? We've seen this hockey stick growth in investing. There's always been question marks around whether there is correlation or causation with ESG factors in investing, and this is really just part of that conversation as it evolves. And just one last thing, I mean, we're going to hear lots from the SEC when it comes to ESG. There's been very positive commentary around increasing disclosure potentially from the acting chair and also from the current nominee. And so the truth is we're going to see more discussion around what can happen with ESG disclosure and regulation moving forward. That would probably take us something more in the direction of where Europe is at.
All right, that's great. Thanks, Craig. All right, Colin, I think you are going to inflate us with your thoughts today. Let me turn it over to you.
Yes, sir. Well, we've gotten CPI and PPI reports from the United States. They were very strong, the strongest in years. And, we think it's important to reiterate the point that we are seeing monetary inflation because of the enormous largesse through fiscal and monetary channels. We're also seeing idiosyncratic temporary price movements, whether it's the auto chip shortage or container story or whatever. It's all logistics writ large. And then in some instances, the price moves are just because of underlying supply-demand fundamentals, whether short run or long run. So let me share a couple of pictures just to give you three flavors of that. The first price we're paying attention to with special focus this week is the ICE CO2 emissions futures price. Today, April 13th, it got to $53 per metric ton. The original price is in euros per ton, so this adjusts for the FX effect. And you can see there, that's the highest price that this CO2 market has ever gotten to. Now, what's happening here is the United States administration, the Biden administration, has set a social cost of carbon by fiat at $51 per metric ton. So this is not some sort of transition from what's happening with monetary numbers. This is literally a market going to where legislation has set it. And you can see here on the right panel that the movement has been from the bottom left to the top right, very strong momentum and energy in this price formation. Here's the forward curve for this futures market. You can see it's in contango all the way out to December 27, where the price gets to be $58.34 per ton. Lots of concentration here in the low 50s. Open interest in the market across all tenors is now almost $41 billion, of which $25 billion, just about 61% of total open interest, rests in the 2021 contracts. And about $11.5 billion, 28% of the total OI, rests in this December 22 contract at $52.96. Turning to the California LCFS credit price, this is the low carbon fuel standard credit market in California. The average price at the end of March was $197 per metric ton. So notice these two markets kind of keying in on similar concepts. It's important to point out that California is all greenhouse gas emissions, so arguably it's picking up an implied price for methane and other greenhouse gases. The range in that week was 179 to 213. And in that same week, the cumulative value traded in this market got to $6 billion for the first time. The weekly volume was 1.3 million metric tons. Cumulative volume is 30 million metric tons. And the point we make is, take a look at this last bar. It was the most actively traded period for LCFS credits in the recent history of this market, which has sort of ebbed and flowed through its history since 2009. So an important point to make, that is not monetary inflation, that is actual market making activity. And then the Bitcoin price, yeah, go ahead, Maynard.
Sorry to jump in, but I was just thinking that this is some new concepts for a lot of us. An LCFS credit. So what exactly is being traded there? Do you mind just
Yeah, so in a
Helping us
nutshell, the first market is putting a price on an emissions allowance of carbon dioxide. So you basically get a permit to emit carbon dioxide specifically. And in the California market, there's basically a baseline of an objective for low carbon fuel in transportation. And if you sort of beat your bogey, you get a credit. And if somebody else doesn't, they need a credit. And so there's a market to sort of trade performance relative to a baseline. So both of them basically have a sense of creating permission to have emissions, but slightly different variations on the theme.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. And then if we look at Bitcoin, as you know, we've really been tracking this since more than a year ago, back here in March of 2020, anticipating that this avalanche of money would manifest an anti-dollar asset price appreciation, and that's certainly what happened. Since we had Danny Masters on the program back in May, the price has gone from 8,600 to 9,175 in July, 10,300 in September. We had Danny back on December 30th. It was at 26,895 on that day. And then we got these quick successions through major thresholds, 20,000, 30,000, 40, 50, 60. And intraday today, it's at 63,246 as this market responds to the CPI print in the United States. We've been anticipating that you could get to maybe $75,000 if the price in logarithmic terms made a price peak comparable to what we saw in 2017. We still appear to be in that upside channel, so no change in that view. But certainly, the speculators, the global macro traders like Stan Druckenmiller and Paul Tudor Jones, who have acknowledged that they got long in this October period, I would wager that the global macro community is going to be wanting to take profits here at some point, at least in the short run. So this is the way that we're tracking how the global macro trader will be feeling about the Bitcoin price. You may have seen that Jay Powell was on 60 Minutes on Sunday. This is how the Fed continues to look at the inflation story, still looking at core inflation targeted at 2%. And obviously, we are not at full employment. So the Fed would have you believe that inflation is contained. And if you see it, it's all temporary. But let's not forget, the whole point is that they are going to allow it to get into this upper range, as we've shown before. And so if we have the kind of volatility that we've seen in the past, we should expect that even core CPI or PCE will have a 3% print within the next couple of years, which means headline inflation will get to 5 or 6%. And that's what the bond market is responding to. So for our clients, while you may be looking at Russian troops massing on the border of Ukraine and thinking, okay, maybe there's a geopolitical risk premium getting put into oil, which is true, don't forget that there also are these really powerful fixed income forces that may give us higher interest rates, whether the Fed gives it to us or a market gives it to us.
Colin,
So
maybe
Colin,
just a follow-up on
get in
that.
there,
I mean, I think we obviously we're watching housing pricing. We're seeing what's happening with potato chips. Anyone kind of looking at the indicators would probably think that inflation rates are significantly higher than what the Fed prints. Can you just talk, I guess, a bit about the policy and how they set that and kind of the metric they're watching versus what might be a bit more real world oriented?
Sure. So the complaint from the macro community is that core PCI has all sorts of hedonic adjustments, they're called, so that they basically sandbag the headline numbers to look like something that does not approximate the real world. And so owner's equivalent rent is, the famous line item that people would point out. And as you mentioned, as we've talked about before, if you look at potato chips, they're up 9% year over year. So, when you start averaging thousands of prices across the economy, you can begin telling a lot of different stories. The broad point is it's true that if you take out energy and food, you might only have 1.6% inflation. Does it make any sense to take out energy and food is kind of the question for the average person. And so while, people can sort of quibble over where we're going with any of this, I think, the real story is inflation has, of course, followed this massive amount of money supply. And at some point, we will see the Fed forced into raising interest rates in response.
I think it was a great question, Matt, because I feel like everywhere I look and everywhere anyone I know is looking, everything is going up in prices. Like it's just so we shall see. So thanks, Colin. Well, let me get back to where we were, which is welcoming our guest, Erik Milito. Again, he's the president of the National Ocean Industries Association. I think those of us who grew up in energy, of course, associate NOIA with offshore drilling, but it's really all offshore energy of any kind. Erik, I know anyone doing business in the offshore, plus or minus in the energy world, you're talking to them and thinking about their interests. So thank you for joining us. And let me just start by saying welcome. And how are you surviving in Washington, D.C.? I hear it's a place where nobody argues and everybody just loves each other and everybody agrees on energy.
Well, the streets are kind of bare these days. We're located right downtown between the White House and the Capitol. And I go out and take my jog along the mall because if you live in DC and you're a runner, that's the place to do it. And the streets are bare. Traffic is picking up dramatically. I'm not sure where everybody's going, but we work right downtown and it's still quiet. So we don't have as much of the arguing that you normally would expect.
One thing, this is a slight departure, Erik, but I have a good friend who was up in DC last week, and we were just talking about the difference between Texas, Oklahoma, a lot of the energy producing states, and then, the places where investors and government people are, New York City, Washington, D.C., et cetera. They're very different from a COVID standpoint right now. Down here, we're getting more and more normal every day. And in Washington and New York, they're still waiting, just very different mentalities as well as kind of realities. Does that affect your day-to-day life? You're having to live in two worlds because so many of your clients are in places where it's better, and where you're working, it's kind of hard.
It really hasn't. I would say that we seem to be working more since the pandemic went into effect and then the lockdowns went into effect. We haven't traveled, but we've been kind of glued to the laptop. And I think a lot of people have been experiencing the inability to really separate from work because you're kind of always with it. I'm home now. I'm in my daughter's room because my wife was using the office for a webinar, but we're kind of always there. And given what we've been going through outside of the pandemic, election year, then a transition to a new Congress and administration, that's when things really pick up for a trade association. And we're small. Prior to the pandemic, we put in place flexible working arrangements. That's what you got to do to attract the best talent. And we have, a lot of our staff, both parents work, have kids. I'm home now because, this evening I'm taking my 10-year-old twins to their swimming lessons. So we got a balance. And so we were heading in that direction, and now we're kind of used to it. But we've been very busy because of all the activity in DC outside of the pandemic.
Oh, it's stunning when you think about all that changeover and all the it's pretty amazing what you guys have been through. Do you want to? I know I didn't mention in your upfront. It's fascinating. For 17 plus years, you were a long time at the API before you came to NOIA, so you're no stranger to energy trade associations and how energy companies think. Why don't you maybe just for our audience's sake, give us a quick introduction to NOIA in your own words, just so people have a sense of the size and scope and how you guys think about things.
Yeah, should I kick off the slideshow? Would that be good?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, Erik.
All right. So thank you all again. So we're an organization that's going to turn 50 next year. So it's amazing to think that, a lot of discussion around offshore in the Gulf of Mexico being potentially an area that's really in decline, but the opposite is true. I mean, it's really a booming region for oil and gas development. And if you think back to, the original offshore wells on piers offshore California, that's late 1800s. But we were organized 50 years ago, and we represent, like you said, offshore energy, offshore oil and gas, offshore wind. We actually have an offshore critical mining company now in our membership. So we bring together the companies that are producing oil and gas offshore, the companies that are developing wind offshore, and then the entire supply chain. I would say that 75% of our membership is the supply chain. And it's really a great organization because of that, because we're able to get all perspectives, all viewpoints, and you and your clients are well aware that the supply chain does so much when it comes to developing these multi-billion-dollar offshore projects, whether it's oil and gas or wind. And it's important to have that perspective and really to help sometimes make them the face of the industry. We've revamped the organization, we've modernized it, and that's because it's such a great industry when it comes to the level of sophistication, the level of capital investment, the innovation. Houston being the home of oil and gas and NASA. Well, what's happening offshore in deep water, it can be compared to space exploration because of the technology that goes into it. So we revamped our mission to really reflect how we're part of the energy solutions. It's not just about oil and gas, but these are energy companies. They're companies that are really looking to be part of the future energy portfolio, no matter what it may hold. We're the voice, advocate, and forum for the industry. We talk to folks like you, we talk to the press, we talk to Congress, the administration. We're very active lobbying and actually getting out there and educating anyone who wants to understand really the facts, science, and data behind our industry. And we believe we're part of the solutions to issues that are challenging our times, like climate change, and we're really focused on that. So we do education, outreach, advocacy, and collaboration. It's been great to see the way our companies really do work together and learn from each other. We'll have a multinational, large major oil company learning from a small service company, and vice versa. It really is a collaborative learning environment that we have. Our objectives are what you expect from a trade association, but in the end, we're there to advance and promote the interests of the offshore energy industry. And we actually have our own ESG program that we created over a year ago. It's been really successful. We've had over 40 companies sign pledges committing to participate in our program. And we bring in experts to talk about investor expectations. We have panels of companies to come forward and talk about emissions reductions technologies and best practices. We have Sustainability Accounting Standards Board came in and talked about transparency and reporting. And we're really bringing everybody together because we have a lot of companies that are really mature in their ESG programs. We have companies that are getting off the ground, and it's been a real good way for us to really elevate performance in this area. And we're telling a story every day. We heard earlier how we're almost back to 100 million barrels a day. The U.S. about 20 million barrels per day. So our position that we take, and it's based on a lot of important factors, is that as long as the U.S. needs energy, it's important to get it here domestically, and it's important to get it here from the offshore region. Here's the 100 million barrels a day that we've talked about, getting back there. And then, we look at the global energy portfolio, and we see that liquids are going to be an important component of that for years to come. A lot of what I'm talking about, you guys are very aware of, and a lot of your clients are, but hopefully I'll have some information here to really shed some new light on some issues and some favorable factors for the offshore. But what you also see is that the growth in renewables, and that's why, you would think that you could have the oil and gas industry kind of in conflict with the renewable sector like offshore wind, but it is really fitting really nicely together within our organization, and it's providing significant opportunities. So a lot of the data I'm showing you is either from EIA or IEA, and we continue to see that the offshore region provides about 30% of oil supplies globally. We kind of have been sitting at that percentage for some time, and we sit at that percentage. We're about there today, and that's just something that a lot of the public doesn't recognize. But it's important to highlight that because in the U.S. we hear about unconventional, we hear about fracking, but there's a lack of recognition around how much oil and energy comes from offshore globally. And then the Gulf of Mexico. This continues to be the backbone of U.S. energy production. The Gulf of Mexico has been producing more than 1 million barrels per day since '97. Right before the pandemic in 2019, it hit record levels at more than 2 million barrels a day. And I believe that was in August and in November. it continues to be a tremendous investment region for our industry, and the industry continues to be able to get out there and make discoveries. If you look globally, we only trail Guyana when you're looking at the amount of oil that's been discovered between 2015 and 2019. So we still are sitting on, in our backyard, what I always refer to as the backbone of U.S. energy production, because it's been steady, reliable for decades, and it continues to be that way today. And when you look at the footprint, this is information we got from our government, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement Director and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management provided some of this information. But there are 18 facilities in deep water that are producing 75% of our offshore oil. And that's 10% of our nation's oil production. That's 9 city blocks is the amount of physical space that takes up. It's an incredible fact that a lot of people really aren't aware of, but 18 facilities amounting for the same amount of production as the entire state of North Dakota. It's incredible what we can do. You can take just massive amounts of energy production through these facilities. You can sidetrack into these formations and tie back into these facilities and really do a lot with a little. And that's another area that we're trying to promote in terms of the small environmental footprint of our industry. If you look at the decline of the wells, the decline curve offshore after 1 year, about a 10% decline, whereas a lot of the other basins are at a much higher level. So it's very well positioned moving forward as we head into and go through what likely will be an energy transition. We like to promote the Gulf of Mexico as the region of choice. We did an economic study in the middle of 2020 last year. We got it done in May. And the first thing we did is a snapshot of the economic benefits in 2019. And over 300,000 jobs supported by the Gulf of Mexico, direct, indirect, induced, mostly concentrated around the Gulf Coast. However, every state in the country has jobs and businesses that are supporting the Gulf of Mexico oil and gas sector. So that's an incredible story in and of itself, where you have, in Maine, you have buoy manufacturers, and in Oregon, you have concrete engineering companies. In Hawaii, you have companies that are experts in underwater types of technologies. It's just amazing the types of companies throughout the country that currently support the offshore. Government revenues, those are bonus bids, royalties, and rentals in the billions every year. And really, since the year 2000, more than 120 billion has been provided from offshore oil and gas development to the federal coffers. And the Land and Water Conservation Fund, a lot of people may not be aware of that program, but that is almost exclusively funded by revenues from offshore oil and gas. We like to focus on low carbon barrels as a key factor for why the offshore is a region of choice. This data comes from Wood Mackenzie, where they benchmarked all the producing regions around the world, and offshore continues to stand out as providing the lowest carbon intensity per barrel when you're looking at all the oil producing regions. And then when this...
do you mind, Erik, just back to this slide? Because I think this is a really important part of today's world and today's discussion. And maybe I might ask you, I know you spend a lot of time with lawmakers. How do you walk policymakers and senators and representatives and such through this? How do you help them understand it? Because as I understand this is really causing a number of people in Washington to be positive on the deep water.
Absolutely. And we sit down and explain that we have projects that are at a scale of investment, at a scale of innovation, at a scale of production, and that are continuing to advance technologies to reduce emissions such that this region stands out when it comes to carbon intensity. These are really, in many respects, these are industrial facilities offshore that are always under operation that have to be tightly controlled. You can't really have methane emissions. You can't really have opportunities for leaks because of the safety concerns that arise, because these are confined spaces, and because you're producing so much from such a small footprint, you're able to get that carbon intensity per barrel down to a very low level. This here is the average for the global marketplace when it comes to each of these regions. So you'll see, around 20 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel of oil equivalent. We've seen studies recently that show U.S. offshore to Gulf of Mexico being around 7 or 8 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel. So this is the global average. There are some areas around the world that are actually doing a little better than us. We're never done working on trying to improve our carbon footprint, but right now, deep water and shelf operations are at the bottom of the spectrum. So we sit down, we make this case. We think it's resonating because in the end, based on those original slides showing that the U.S. over the next several decades, the world over the next several decades, are going to continue to rely upon oil and natural gas. Let's make sure we're focusing on getting it from the best regions. First, I would say it's the U.S. because we have the best regulatory framework across the board for onshore and offshore. Second, let's make sure we're getting that from the offshore region because we have the data to support that these barrels are the lowest carbon out of any producing region.
Well, and that last point, there's so many points on this one slide, but the one about North America, the U.S. and Canada being such a great place to do any of these things relative to the rest of the world, that's a huge point. And then, then there is this spectrum. Well, just while we're here, I might ask Colin or Matt in particular, any reactions or questions to this slide? Because I think it's a big part of today's world.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting slide and illustrates an important point because, of course, if you do the math and look at those differentials, you're suddenly in the tens of millions of tons of savings per year. So that really makes a difference. I guess, Erik, my question would be a little bit of an oddball one. We sometimes get questions about wave energy and the idea of how come we don't use the motions of the oceans more often to generate electricity. Have you had any kind of inbound inquiries about wave energy? Any members who are talking about it? I realize it's a little bit of an unfair question, but any anecdotal at all? Because presumably that number would be even closer to zero and would have the obvious benefit of being even better from an emission standpoint.
Absolutely. We have not had any inbound inquiries on this, even from the media, which has been pretty inquisitive when it comes to offshore wind. We play that strong role on the offshore wind side, and we'll hit some of those slides. But the Interior Department has moved forward with a pilot project for wave technology on the West Coast. I'd have to dig up some of that, but you can kind of look around on the Interior website, and you could see probably some of the press clippings out there on that initial project that's getting off the ground. And I think there's tremendous potential for that. One thing that I was going to mention is that these offshore production facilities can be repurposed over time when they meet their end of life. I'm going to talk about how these end up becoming flourishing marine ecosystems, but there's a lot of efforts around the world to really transform them into use for hydrogen technologies, aquaculture, commercial algae, those types of things that could be also part of the next wave of energy solutions. And there's no reason why you cannot also look at a lot of these facilities to perhaps play a role in wave and current energy generation.
Awesome.
Great questions. And when the government leases areas in the Outer Continental Shelf and the offshore, they break the offshore region down into 26 different planning areas, and there's 3 in the Gulf of Mexico. So for really the entire history of our offshore energy development has primarily occurred in the western and the central Gulf of Mexico. Some production off the coast of California, but that's dwindling down to very low amounts, and that's going to probably over time, get decommissioned and go down to zero. But when they have lease sales in these areas, they first have to develop a leasing program. So we're in a leasing program right now that runs from 2017 to 2022. In the program, they put together a schedule of lease sales. If you want to purchase a lease, the 3 miles by 3 miles. The bonus bid minimum is about $250,000, but it's an auction. Sometimes they go for $2 million, sometimes they go for $100 million, but minimum bid is $250,000. But the last time they put together the leasing program, the one we're in now, they did an environmental analysis, and they do several environmental analyses under NEPA, and they put together the environmental impact statements. And they actually did in the Obama administration an analysis of the greenhouse gas emission impacts. And they concluded that GHG emissions would actually be higher if Interior would have no lease sales, because you'd have substitutions from other parts of the world where carbon emissions would be more intensive. So even the Obama administration concluded what we are saying now is that, these are low carbon barrels. Let's focus on these as we move forward. If you look at the Land and Water Conservation Fund, that was put in place in the 60s, but close to $4 billion is funded about 42,000 projects in every state and every county. And these are for national parks, forests, recreational activities. So a lot of what is happening in the oil and gas side is then creating the revenue and it's generating the revenue for these important projects that a lot of people want to see. And more recently, they created the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program. And what this does, this takes funding from offshore oil and gas and commits it to urban parks and recreation to underprivileged communities. So you see here, Jesse Allen Park in Newark got a grant of $750,000. And so these types of programs funded by offshore oil and gas are actually helping to serve underprivileged communities. About $30 million has gone to more than 50 disadvantaged communities. So we like to explain all these benefits because people just don't realize what goes into developing these resources and the output when it comes to the revenue that's generated. We're one of the industries with one of the most stringent regulatory regimes you'll see around the world when it comes to really any industry, but globally, our offshore energy sector is really subject to some of the most stringent regulatory requirements. You've got dozens of statutes. The regulations are voluminous and dozens of approvals, many agencies. So what I would say is, and it's something I've worked on over the past 10, 11 years, is that there have been tremendous revisions and adjustments made to the regulatory system to improve it and enhance it. And an example would be, if you're going to be developing a project in the offshore region, in the deep water, you're required to have access to this type of equipment. These are called containment systems, which weren't in existence back in 2010. And the first well that was drilled after Macondo, they didn't approve the drilling of that well until this type of equipment was in place. These are now becoming more common globally, but now if you're going to drill, you got to be a member of HWCG or MWCC, and that's just one component. We have a real focus on the three legs of the stool: prevention, intervention, and response. But 99.9% of the effort is on the prevention side, and a lot of innovation and technology go into that as well. A lot of research is coming out now that is showing that these structures below the surface of the ocean are really turning into some of the most flourishing marine ecosystems. And if you think of the red snapper populations, the Gulf of Mexico is a muddy sea bottom, which isn't really amenable to the red snapper. They need a hard type of environment where you can have the reef that grows. And because of these types of structures that have evolved into marine ecosystems, we now have a strong red snapper fishery in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's just one example. But we're finding more and more research that shows that for certain species, these types of structures are actually better ecosystems than some natural reefs. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of these that come to end of life. And you have organizations like the Gulf Offshore Research Institute that is trying to work with the federal government to try to use them as a test lab, as a really a research and development opportunity to try out and test new types of technologies on new types of energy. And of course, national security. Our former secretaries of defense are I'm a military guy. It's one of the reasons why I like representing the U.S. oil and gas industry and the wind industry. We should be developing it here because just what you see in front of you, we have a map here that shows the leases on the U.S. side of the Gulf of Mexico and the leases on the Mexico side of the Gulf of Mexico. And already in Mexican waters, there's more than twice as much acreage under lease than we have in our side on the Gulf of Mexico. So this is just one glimpse. Of course, the offshore oil and gas market is global. So you've got areas offshore, West Africa, off the coast of South America, Guyana, Southeast Asia, everywhere around the world, companies have a choice. And the more we're able to create predictability, certainty, and opportunities for development, the better we are, because, we don't have to depend on imports. We can do it here at home and continue to rely on the Gulf of Mexico. This is a great quote.
Can I ask you a question while you're on this previous topic? Because this has come up on our show before, and I would say it's, national security used to be such a dominant theme to energy policy, like it was for decades. And then, we achieved so much, and then that bullet point has seemingly, this is just an impression, it seems to have dropped a lot in people's consciousness. Is that right? When you're with Congress people and administration people, like, what is Washington, D.C.'s frame of reference around that national security debate right now?
Well, D.C. often reflects where a lot of the country is, because they're going to follow their constituencies, and Americans take things for granted. The price of oil went up to $140 a barrel in 2008. That's when they started moving to lift the moratorium on offshore drilling on the Atlantic and the Pacific. And over the past several years, with the boom in unconventionals and the continued production from offshore, we've had this dramatic impact on places like Russia and Iran and other places in the Middle East that really rely upon their own cells of hydrocarbons and liquids and oil for their budgets, for their military. It just happened because of U.S. production. But once again, we kind of take it for granted, but it's not something that we should gloss over, because it has a huge impact in geopolitics, where everybody recognizes how often Russia uses its energy as a geopolitical tool. But when our allies come to us and we start developing and producing more gas and shipping it by LNG, they're on our side and we're on their side, and we're creating this diminishing influence in circles like Russia and places like Iran. And we can't let that go by taking policy steps that would reduce U.S. energy production, because while we may take it for granted now, in a year or two, we could see that demand crunch and that supply, there's questions around supply that could impact prices like you guys talk about quite often. But also on the national security side, if we're not producing it here, of course the production will shift to other parts of the world, and they would gladly have it and use it in the ways that they've used it in the past, which are not good for national security and our allies.
Do you think you could get a big pipeline built offshore right now? We've all been watching these discussions with Keystone and DAPL and so on and so forth, and I know it's a different kind of permitting process, et cetera, but big infrastructure offshore, are people focused on stopping that like they are on some other things?
Not that I've seen. I think because you have a different legal and regulatory regime, it's not as easy to disrupt as what you have in many of these instances, like DAPL and Keystone. In one respect, you have an offshore region that is entirely under the authority of the federal government, so you don't run into these local issues. You don't have fence line issues when it comes to environmental justice. We're miles away from communities, so you don't have those fence line environmental justice issues that are coming up with this administration. And then you don't have the local issues when it comes to the protests around those projects. But all your eggs are in the federal basket when it comes to the decision making. And we've seen the Biden administration put the pause in place for federal offshore leasing, which, that's created uncertainty. I'm optimistic. I believe that we'll get to where we need to be because of everything I've laid out. But, the federal government makes all the decisions, and, it'll be up to this administration to move forward with it. But I will say that they had a virtual forum a couple of weeks ago. I presented on behalf of the industry. Secretary Holland spoke and said, if you have leases existing out there, you're going to be able to use them. They've been permitting, and the permitting has been moving forward for all types of permits, and that includes infrastructure. So I do think we're in a different situation based on the law and the regulations, and I'm optimistic that we'll be okay when it comes to that type of infrastructure. If you think about gas that goes to Florida, it almost all comes from the Gulf of Mexico from that pipeline from Mobile down to that Tampa area. So there already is a very strong, robust marketing and transportation network in the Gulf of Mexico. So any changes and any build out of that is kind of minimal compared to what's already in place.
Erik, maybe just a follow on to that question. Pretty much day one, as the Biden administration took over, there was a lot of concern around the federal leasing, and in particular the 60-day moratorium. Do you think the process has progressed, that the industry may actually get a fair shake here, and that we may see the ability to actually permit in the future on federal acreage? Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion around New Mexico in particular, given the importance of the Permian and the production exposure there. But you also mentioned that the obviously amount of production associated with it, and obviously a little bit of a different framework there. But just curious if there's any data as you look at the policy around DC towards the stance on federal permitting moving forward.
Yeah, it's a great question. On day one, they put in place a 60-day order, which shifted authority to headquarters in Washington when it came to approving permits. So there was a lot of concern around that. It did create some delay because the new administration wanted to understand how things were progressing on the permitting side. But it moved in the right direction, and we haven't seen anything holding permitting up in the Gulf of Mexico, and that's for exploration programs as well as development programs, and that's really for all the authorizations and approvals when it comes to rights of way and the easements the companies are putting in for. So it's been moving along, and Secretary Holland reiterated that permitting is going to continue, and they have legal precedent that works against them. Back in 2010. There was a moratorium on permitting that was put in place. The Fifth Circuit struck that down. Companies have contracts. The contracts require the government to, hold its end of the bargain when it comes to being a party to the contract, and allow companies to move forward with developing those projects. So, but in the end, I think they recognize that, that they are now governing, and it's not just politics anymore. And they've moved forward with the permitting. They have paused, the leasing. There was one lease sale scheduled for March. We're hopeful that they can reschedule that, or they would start back up with the fall lease sale for the Gulf of Mexico. It's unclear, but they're taking comments on this review they're doing through tomorrow. But I read the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, which governs this, as requiring leasing. Others would argue differently, but I think when you use the term shall, SHALL, I think it means you must lease, and I'm optimistic we'll get to where we need to be on the leasing side too. But great question. This is a great quote, came from the Washington Post editorial board. I just like to highlight it. It just talks about how as long as we need energy, the best place to get it is in the U.S. rather than a place with weaker environmental standards. This, ironically, was an editorial that was put in place to discuss the decision then Secretary Zinke made when he met with the governor of Florida and decided to take areas off the table from leasing. And the Washington Post stood up and said, hold on a second, we need this here in the U.S. We're the best place to do it. We have better environmental standards. And we shouldn't be so arrogant to not want to develop resources here when the global oil market is going to depend upon them. So I like that because it's from the Post and it really hits home. Wind, the Atlantic coast sets up very well. I mentioned our supply chain. When you look at oil and gas offshore is a marine construction activity. Wind offshore is a marine construction activity. So we have marine construction companies, offshore service vessel companies, subsea engineering companies, manufacturers, safety consultants. A lot of our members, dozens, are interested in it, and many have already played a role in building out a couple of the two projects that are already in place. There's only 7 turbines up and running along the Atlantic, Block Island, offshore Rhode Island, in Rhode Island state waters, and then offshore Virginia, there's 2. But we're poised. You can see on the left the amount of power that's required for the Atlantic coast. It's highly densely populated. You don't have a lot of space there to put turbines up, and you've got that view shed issue where a lot of the local populations don't want them in their backyard. You've got strong wind, and you've got on the right side an extended shelf where you could put the fixed turbines, the monopiles or the jackets right onto the seafloor. The floating technology is moving along, and you're going to need that in the Gulf of Maine and on the West Coast, but the Atlantic sets up very well for the fixed structures. Here you can just see the wind capacity and how our offshore region, really around all the coast, sets up very well for offshore wind power generation. We worked with several other trade associations to do a study on the impacts of continued leasing. That's the number 3 Wood Mackenzie study there. You could have, by 2030, another 25 gigawatts, support a lot of jobs and investment. And this is why you see a lot of the companies that develop oil and gas offshore stepping into this. They have the engineering expertise to be able to manage this scale of a project. And then that same supply chain has a business interest as well. And then if you look, to the left of the number 3, that's really looking at the demand that's being driven by the procurements that are currently being directed by those states: Connecticut, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Virginia. They're coming forward and directing procurement of offshore wind for their power sector. And so that's, 22 to 25 gigawatts of wind through 2030. So that's 60 billion and a lot of jobs. So we're pushing this. The Biden administration at the end of March announced its wind strategy. A lot of the delays have been because of NEPA at the federal level. We saw the fishermen step up and object to the Vineyard Wind environmental impact statement. So they had to go back to the drawing board and do more of that environmental analysis. That's now done. They're waiting for comment. They'll come out with their record of decision. But Interior said they're going to come out with 16 more decisions on these construction and operation plans for 16 different projects. And so we see this moving pretty quickly through the approval side of the House. There likely could be some litigation because of NEPA and because some of the opposition from some of the commercial fishing entities. But we're pretty optimistic this is going to happen. But just like offshore oil and gas, this will take a number of years to get these projects constructed and operational. There's also a lot of talk about the Gulf of Mexico being a good place because of the infrastructure for offshore wind. But you have Texas there that already has a significant onshore wind presence, and you really don't have that need like you do along the Atlantic. But you've got an industrial sector there along the Gulf Coast where a lot of these industrial petrochemical type facilities and other factories could utilize some of that energy going directly into their facilities. So there's a lot that's being looked at. Governor Edwards has come out with a plan for offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico, and he's working with Interior on a task force to have that federal state partnership to make things happen in the Gulf for offshore wind. And a lot of interest in California, but we've seen some DoD issues, and we've seen the need for the floating technology that's really coming online. We've seen it in the North Sea, and we've seen it offshore Portugal, and that's going to be something that enables offshore wind in the deeper waters. So
Eric,
I covered a
question.
lot.
Can I ask a quick question on that, Eric? Just to that last point. So not only is it the fishermen who have been commercial fishermen who've been complaining about the offshore wind assets, but also some of the residents of the vineyard and Nantucket and so on. What is kind of the technical limit of how far out some of these assets could be placed, and what's the risk that that does or does not prove to be the solution in having the siting of some of these assets?
Yeah, well, optimally, you want them as close to the coast as you can, because then you're closer to the power grid to get the wind capacity to market. But we all know what happened with the Cape Wind project that got derailed by NIMBYism and the locals not wanting that to happen. But these projects that we're seeing move forward are further out. The latest environmental analysis shows that they're I think 12 miles or further out, and I think that seeing them on the horizon, if you can see them, it would be like a quarter of an inch. So I think enough work has been done to address the viewshed concerns, as well as the concerns of the Coast Guard when it comes to marine vessels, the military, and the fishing community, because the offshore wind developers work together to create a standardized layout for the turbines. It's a 1 mile by 1 mile grid, east to west, north to south. So you've got a mile in between, which more than sufficiently allows all these different uses to coexist. And it's really the trawling type of commercial fishermen, lobstermen, as well as lobstermen, scallop fishermen, and lobstermen that have raised concerns. But we're hopeful that it's one of these things that's new, but over time there will be support. In the Gulf of Mexico, recreational and commercial fishing go hand in hand with offshore facilities, because they stop at the facilities, they get their bait, and then they go and go out and do some of the commercial fishing that they do, or they go right to that facility to get the red snapper or whatever else they're looking for. And people come from all over the country to go to the Gulf of Mexico for that. And we think that over time you'll see a similar phenomenon in the Atlantic, because these structures that are under the water for the turbines also develop and evolve into these types of marine ecosystems. So we're hopeful it'll work out.
Don't you think that offshore solar, does that exist?
It probably does, but I'm not aware. I do know that a lot of companies are using solar for power sources for small, like controllers and valves and those types of things. But I haven't seen that in North America really at all. I vaguely recall seeing some pictures of offshore solar farms, but I would imagine that they would deteriorate a lot quicker, and they would be subject to a lot more severe weather and damage in that environment.
There's a lot of, Maynard, there's a lot on non-tidal water. That's something that will be real, but I think it's probably tough where we've got meaningful tides. The one that struck that I wanted to ask you about, but it might be so nichey, I figured it might not be worth it. That you mentioned the offshore mining. Is that something? I know there's been a little bit of it around the U.S. up in Alaska, and it exists off Namibia and other places. But is there a nascent offshore mining sector? There was a company that just went public that was an offshore mining company through a SPAC recently, caught my attention.
Now, our member is Ocean Med, have leases in the Cook Islands. So they're out of Houston, and they joined us because we've been able to help them get meetings with State Department and others. But they're competing with the Chinese for development of that. I think it's cobalt mining and those nodules that you find at the bottom of the sea. I do know that there's some prospective areas in the U.S. offshore. I'm just not that fluent in those areas.
Erik, one last one I wanted to squeeze in if I could. I was just curious, are any of your members looking, I guess maybe the shallow water environment around carbon sequestration, or just anything on that topic? Because obviously it's becoming a much bigger topic on onshore.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more conversation about that. The CCS or CCUS debate is interesting to me because personally, I've always felt that it's a little further off, and it probably still is. But if you look at the Gulf of Mexico, you do have infrastructure there, and you have old facilities, and you've got companies that have the capacity to be able to sequester it. And I've talked to some of our supply chain companies. They're global, and they're some of the bigger ones, and they are looking at this. And they're, at the end of 2020, I think it was December 27th, they passed the stimulus package. One of the titles at the end, it might have been like Title Z, was the Energy Act of 2020. It's got a lot of money in it for RD&D, and DOE is going to be the one who's giving out that money. So we have a lot of companies that are now trying to work with them to, try a lot of this out now.
Hey, Eric, one last one, just from your feel for this, but obviously the East Coast wind has been held up at the federal level. Everyone feels like that's going to get unblocked. Then you're going to have to deal with just the growing pains of the environmental and the fisheries, et cetera. But do you get the sense that beyond that, whatever it was, 22 or 25 gigs that are in the queue, that there is an explosive amount of interest that's going to come behind that as soon as this gets unlocked? Because they're already big numbers. But do you sense that your members are, teeing up something much, much larger once it comes unstuck?
Yes. Our members, we've been working with our membership to get more of these lease sales on the table. So they announced the new area offshore New York, the New York Bight. That's a big one. But you got the Carolinas, you've got California, you've got Maine. There's a lot of capacity to add on what the original study showed. And when they came out with that study, it was at 22 based upon the state procurements. And like a year later, it was close to 27 or 28. That's just based upon what the states are requesting. There's a lot that has to happen for that to actually be deployed. I talked to some who have experience and believe that it'd be a lot easier along the Gulf Coast to deploy wind capacity. There's concern that you've got a west to east grid on the East Coast. How are they going to get the money and capital to get that adjusted to take, energy coming the other direction? I'm not an expert on that. I've been a driller for, almost 20 years. So for me, that's easy. You break up rock, the oil and gas comes out, you put it in pipes, the refiners, heat it up, and we got gas at the pump, which is better than put a straw in the ground below the gas station. That's where you get your gas.
Well, Eric, you've been really generous with your time. It's fascinating. I was just thinking back on your presentation. You had a something encouraging from the Washington Post about how they see things. You've got some decent reports about how Washington is thinking about energy policy. Offshore wind and oil and gas are becoming friends and working together. I mean, this has been really uplifting. What could we do to help you? Because I know all of us appreciate good energy thinking happening in our nation's capital. What final thoughts might you leave us with, or what? How can we help the Milito family? It'd be great if I had somebody else chauffeur around to 6 soccer games each weekend, but you're there. I'm in Alexandria, Virginia, and I don't know if you want to come to Mack Street headquarters here, but what's important for us to continue to communicate are the real world impacts. I think there was a reaction to the Keystone XL decision that in some respects may not have been expected. We support all the above energy because we need all these sources. We're going to need oil and gas for a long time. But it can be a bit offensive to just move forward and say that, don't worry, oil and gas worker making $150,000 offshore out of Louisiana. We're going to get you a job installing solar panels. That's the tone of the conversation now. And from our standpoint, it's additive. Let's maintain the good jobs that we have now because we need this energy coming from the U.S. and from the U.S. offshore. Let's add to that these opportunities for renewables that we have in a place like the Atlantic. It all can go together. But what we're trying to communicate is that these decisions have impacts. And you guys have expertise in
what it means to have investment uncertainty. And if you're aware of and understand that, we're hearing continually that there's concerns about bringing money into the U.S. because of the policy uncertainty, then it's good for us to be able to communicate that and make it clear that it's with acreage that brings opportunities to develop oil and gas. It's with investment that allows you to get that acreage. And it's with that investment that gives you jobs and the revenues and an increased GDP that we all want. So to the extent that you guys play that role and are engaging that conversation and believe that there's facts or narrative that's missing from the conversation, reach out to us, let us know. And if you're ever in need to and you want to talk to any of these policymakers, we're happy to try to set that up. Rich England, our lobbyist here in Washington, he worked for Pete Olson for several years and did energy analysis for Washington Analysis for a long time. He's got great relationships. We view ourselves as nonpartisan. I mean, people think oil and gas, you're Republican. We think energy is nonpartisan. Everybody should support U.S. energy. And so he's got great relationships on both sides of the aisle, and he can help out as well.
Do you think that I'm thinking about all the other trade associations. Well, one question is, of course, you worked at the API. Do you guys get together and compare notes and, kind of work together? But I was thinking, you uniquely are a trade association that has a little bit oil and gas, a little bit wind. So you've got perhaps a different perspective. But as a final wrap up, what would you tell us about the community of folks like yourself in DC?
Yeah, and it's not just in DC. The International Association of Geophysical Contractors is out of Houston. The International Association of Drilling Contractors is out of Houston. The Energy Workforce and Technology Council is out of Houston. So we Zoom a lot. We like to get together when we can, when we're not in a pandemic. But we work pretty closely together. We're all commenting on this review of oil and gas leasing on federal lands. So we're making sure that, we're making our case to the government, and we all have different aspects that we can bring to the table. But it's important for us to be aligned. We have a lot of common members, but we do, in the end, have different membership. API has refineries, pipelines, and producers. We have oil and gas and wind offshore. The drillers have the drillers. AXPC has the onshore independents, but we work together and we coordinate, we collaborate, and sometimes, most of the time, we're on the same page. But sometimes, we take different positions based upon our membership and our constituencies, and we move forward with the respect and understanding that we gotta work for those that are paying the bills.
Well, we've learned a lot from you today. I think the last comment is we got to make this conversation not just about carbon footprint, but about footprint, period. Right? Because what is your overall impact? And the fact that you have 18 facilities that produce 10% of U.S. oil, I mean, that right there, that's got that minimal, it kind of reminds me of Indian Point, Colin, which is our favorite topic. But anyway, Eric, we could just spin off into Colin. Anything you throw in as we wrap up?
I don't think you can top that last point. I mean, what a measure of efficiency, right? And we got to think about land, water, and air.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Eric, from all of us at COBT. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Take care, guys.